Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. India and Saudi Arabia on Tuesday inked over a dozen agreements in several key sectors including oil and gas, defence and civil aviation to bolster their ties as Prime Minister Narendra Modi held extensive talks with the kingdom's top leadership, during which a strategic partnership council was established to coordinate on important issues. Saudi Arabia has for some time now been looking for new friends in the East. The disappointing response of the United States after half of the kingdom's oil production was knocked out by drone attacks last month, or when the West cornered Riyadh on the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi last year, has only driven it to look east. India is also achieving its strategic goals alongside trade with Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, the bilateral ties between India and the UAE too have reached new heights. Having prospered for several decades, it has more recently advanced into a sterling partnership spanning multiple dimensions, with both countries firmly committed to expanding collaboration in new sectors. Not just Saudi and the UAE, the whole of West Asia is looking to engage with India and explore new frontiers. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze India's ties with West Asia. Joining me on the program today are Harshvi Pant, Head, Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation; Professor A.K. Pasha, Center for West Asian Studies, JNU; and Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Professor, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first look at the India-Saudi Arabia relationship and look at where it's headed. And we'll also analyze the Prime Minister's visit to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, this is the third visit the Prime Minister has made during his first and second term as NDA head of the government. And I think this is unprecedented in Indo-Saudi relations. Because if you see the history briefly, the king, Saudi king who visited was in 1955. And the second was in 2006. So there was a gap of almost 50 years. And in between, only Mrs. Gandhi visited in 1982. So there was this long communication gap. But after 9/11 and particularly after 2006, relations have substantially improved. One, because of 9/11. Number two, because of their shift on the issue of terrorism. And related to that was their change in their stand on Pakistan and Kashmir. Since then, they have been looking towards Indian position on these two issues, and they have clearly dehyphenated. Pakistan, to a very large extent, is no more a factor influencing Indo-Saudi relations, which was a factor in 60s and 70s. So the oil energy sector also is looking up. India is a major market, 18% of our supplies come from Saudi Arabia, trade partner, nearly $32 billion, then about 3 million Indian workers there, and Indian companies, over 150, are there in various trade zones, both in public and private sector. So the Indian workers, energy security, trade, investments, more importantly, cooperation in the defense sector and intelligence and counter-terrorism also has picked up over the last 6 to 7 years.
Sure.
So all put together, there is this meeting of eye to eye on a variety of issues, and now it has reached a level where the Joint Strategic Council has been formed regularly. Apart from the earlier foreign ministers' conferences and joint commissions, which used to meet and thrash out many of the issues, there are no major problems as such. But this cooperation also between the two countries is underlined by regional turmoil.
Right.
I mean, whether it is Lebanon or Iraq or Iran and Yemen and Bahrain and all of these things. I think both the countries are trying to see how security and stability and peaceful relations in this area can be galvanized between these two major powers.
Right, sure. All right.
Just the defense cooperation, the Saudis, we were used to having naval cooperation, I mean joint exercises. But now I think they are looking for Indian advisors at various levels. So that the National Guards and the Saudi Defense Forces are properly equipped to face the challenges. Weapons is not a problem. They buy the latest weapons from Europe and America.
Absolutely.
So in that way, defense cooperation is also part of the elevation to the strategic level along with counter-terrorism and intelligence sharing.
Absolutely. You know, Ambassador, what has changed in recent times? Because up until a few years ago, Saudi Arabia was openly supporting Pakistan on several of the issues. If you go back to the 1971 war as well, the Saudis came out heavily in support of Pakistan. What has happened in recent times?
Well, Professor Pasha very correctly mentioned that we have succeeded in getting the Saudis and other Gulf Arab countries to dehyphenate India and Pakistan. But equally important is the fact that, as he underlined, that there was an unnecessary gap at high-level interaction. Now, during the long years I spent in West Asian countries, I often heard an Arabic phrase that those who forget their friends steal away the sunshine from the earth. What was being implied was that we were neglecting our friends in the Arab countries, that there were visits from these countries to India, but there were very few visits from India to those countries. Now, that has changed radically in the last few years. Prime Minister Modi is criticized by some quarters of the media and the intelligentsia for making too many foreign visits. But the fact is that nothing can substitute close, high-level interaction. As the professor mentioned, Prime Minister has visited Saudi Arabia, of course twice, UAE thrice. He has also visited Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, Iran, Palestine and Israel. He has successfully been able to dehyphenate in the Arab thinking Israel and Palestine, which has been very important for us, because one factor which impeded the proper growth of Indo-Arab relations was the question of Israel. Of course, we were supporting the Palestinian position, but that was impeding our relationship with the Israelis. Then we normalized relations with the Israelis, and that began to be an impediment in our relationship with the Arabs. He has successfully dehyphenated, our Prime Minister, he has dehyphenated the Arabs from the Israelis in terms of our foreign policy perceptions. Equally important is the fact that in recent years, the Arab perception of India has changed quite a lot. India is now seen not only as a regional power, but as an emerging global power. India is seen as the world's 5th largest economy, as being a nuclear state, as a state which has the 2nd largest army and is the 3rd largest importer of weapons in the world. So the perception of India is as an emergent, a nascent world power. That, of course, qualitatively changes the manner in which they are prepared to interact with us. During Prime Minister's visit, 12 agreements were signed, all very significant, but even more significant was the fact that we signed a strategic cooperation agreement, and the manner in which both sides perceive this agreement is very significant, because it is very, very far-reaching. Of course, both Saudi Arabia and India view each other as investment destinations. For us, the Saudis are a very important investment partner. They are very important for us in terms of our energy security, and the Saudis have promised to invest quite a lot in some of our infrastructure projects relating to the petroleum sector. So, from a stage when we had, of course, close economic relations, where we saw the Saudis as a market for our goods, where the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, source their requirements of immigrant labor. From all that, the relationship has grown manifold, and is poised to grow even more in the future, because of the manner in which this equation is being addressed at the top. I repeat, close personal relations at the top always percolate downwards, and we are witnessing that is happening.
Absolutely. And Professor Pant, before we move on to the other countries in West Asia, let's focus a little more on Saudi Arabia because of this recent visit of the Prime Minister there. Let's not forget that India imports about a quarter of our oil from, almost a quarter of our oil from Saudi Arabia as well. Saudi Arabia is now looking at investments in India, strategic investments in India. So, you know, after looking west for several decades, now the Saudis seem to be looking east towards India and China as well.
Yeah, I think that is, in terms of the larger structural realities in global politics, I think that is one that is shaping Saudi's, new engagement towards the east. And this has been happening gradually since mid 2000s, but I think it has really picked up momentum in the last few years. Two things have happened. One, you have the whole Saudi model, economic model, which is being questioned now. So there, the Crown Prince is trying to have trying to give an alternative vision to Saudi Arabia's economic program. And I think for him, it is very important that West is a partner, but actually where is the economic growth coming from? It's not coming from the West, it's coming in the East. So if you look at their Vision 2030, where they have laid out 8 countries, and most of these countries are Asian countries, where India and China are 2 very important partners for Saudi Arabia going forward. So I think there is a larger reality for Saudi Arabia as it confronts new economic challenges, as it tries to modernize its economy beyond oil. It has to look to partners like India, emerging economic powers, where it can invest and from which it can seek investment. So I think clearly the relationship with India has gone through a qualitative change. We used to talk only about energy even 5 years before. Now we are talking of a gamut of issues, which I think underscores the long distance that this relationship has traveled just in a very short span of time. And I think the fact that these conversations are happening at a time when you have this larger perception in Saudi foreign policy community, as well as I think in the larger West Asia, which we can come to a bit later. But I think particularly in Saudi, because Saudi-US relationship was the bedrock of regional stability. And I think as there are questions around that as to what exactly are American intentions vis-a-vis Saudis, vis-a-vis the region, I think they are looking for new partners, and India, with its growing global footprint, emerges as a partner which has multiple entities. It is not simply an economic power, but also now a growing defense partner, as I think was pointed out earlier, that they are looking towards a qualitatively new defense engagement with India. And of course, if you are looking at countering terrorism, then the entire belt, West Asia and South Asia become very, very important for both India and for Saudis. And so, intelligence cooperation and counter-terror cooperation become very, very significant for both these countries, as well as maritime cooperation. So I think for Saudis, the relationship has to change if you have to move into the 21st century with a vision, not only domestically, but also how their foreign policy challenges are to be met. And I think that is being reflected in how they have viewed this engagement. And that is also reflected in the way India has reciprocated, and right. Mr. Modi leading from the front by engaging the top leadership very, very regularly, and it has paid dividends.
And talking about engaging with the top leaderships, let's focus on some of the other countries in West Asia as well. We've been engaging with the leadership at the highest level with the UAE as well. There have been several visits to and fro. Of course, Prime Minister Modi has received the highest honor, civilian honor as well from the UAE. So how has the relationship with UAE also changed, Professor, in recent times?
Yeah, before I answer, let me add a footnote to the Indo-Saudi relations. The Saudis have tried industrializing and modernizing their economy with Western help, America and Europe, for the last 50 plus years. It hasn't taken them very far. They are impressed with Indian economic performance, our mixed economy, which has paid rich dividends. So they are looking for small and medium scale industries and software particularly to provide employment to a large number of youngsters who are going to be part of this 2030 Saudi vision. This is one aspect which they find very attractive as far as economic cooperation and scientific and technological areas are concerned. The second thing is they were disappointed on 2 counts. One is President Trump's statement that Saudi Kingdom cannot survive, the ruling family, without American support for more than 2 weeks. The second one was the Pakistanis' refusal to be part of that the coalition fighting the Yemen war. So these two were tectonic changes in their defense and security policies. And what I am thinking is the gradual shift away from these 2 key players as far as their regime security was concerned, and they increasingly look towards India, a stable partner with huge military, nuclear power, and well disposed towards their aspiration. Coming to the UAE, UAE was lying low for almost 50 years. It's only last 2 years that MBZ has taken upon himself a very activist role as far as Iran is concerned and other hotspots in the area. And it is in that line that they also look towards India to be a major player along with them in this region. And we had the best of trade relations with UAE, nearly $100 billion if you put oil and non-oil together. And over 2.5 million Indian workers, and investments were flowing without any push from the top. But now again, like Saudi Arabia, the level of relationship has reached where we cooperate on a variety of issues. Counter-terrorism is one, and defense cooperation, and frequent military exercises also, which are part of the. And now that the Indian Ocean Rim Association is going to be headed by the UAE along with other partners, it's going to play an important role. So in that way, UAE and Saudi Arabia are now major players in the region. If you see Turkey, Qatar and Iran on the other side. So both are trying to extend their influence, whether it is Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen or Bahrain, Egypt, Libya, all of these hotspots. These two countries are playing a very important role. So in that way, there is only one point of caution I want to mention, that in Saudi Arabia, the arrest of many members of the House of Saud by the MBS, has created bad blood.
Right.
And once the king is out of the scene, we have to see cautiously whether MBS will consolidate his position and bring other members of the family to make his Vision 2030 fruitful. Same is the case in UAE. The MBZ has faced criticism from the ruler of Dubai and Sharjah and Fujairah, where from most of the soldiers in Yemen were killed and bodies were brought back, and there was a lot of furor. And Dubai is particularly upset with Abu Dhabi because of the sanctions on Iran, which is hurting, because much of the commerce in Dubai is linked to exports to Iran, and from there to Afghanistan, Central Asia. It's a huge market.
Sure.
So it is this contradictions we have to keep in mind and not identify too closely with their external involvements, which may also affect our interest in that region.
Absolutely. Talking about concern areas, Ambassador, since the professor brought it up as well, on the other side we have Turkey, Iran and Qatar, players in that particular region. So what is our relationship like with these three countries or that particular bloc? And also, because we've gotten closer to, say, Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, we've had traditional ties with Iran, and because of the sanctions by the US as well, at some level, do you believe that Iran is getting neglected?
Well, the sanctions which the US has placed on Iran certainly impact our relationship with that country. We cannot have a full-fledged relationship if these sanctions are in place. As regards Turkey, well, we have begun to reevaluate our relationship with that country, because in the context of our problems with Pakistan, Turkey has not taken a very helpful position. And so naturally, we will reevaluate our own thinking in this regard. Qatar is an important source of natural gas to us. There are a very large number of Indians in Qatar. Our relationship is good, but Qatar is having its own problems with its neighbors within the GCC. So while these problems have not directly impacted our own relationship with Qatar, but we have concerns about certain aspects which could, in the course of the future, have an impact. Particularly, the roles which some organizations based over their play. Sometimes the kind of broadcasting with Al Jazeera does, the fact that the Taliban leadership has been based there, and how its presence there will impact on the future of Afghanistan. These are concerns for us. But nonetheless, the major players in West Asia at the moment are Saudi Arabia, UAE, and on the other side, Israel. And we have a flourishing relationship with all three. Iraq is also extremely important for us. It is now the largest supplier of petroleum products to India, followed by Saudi Arabia, followed by the UAE. So the three largest exporters of petroleum products at the moment are all located in West Asia. So our relationship naturally is of considerable importance even in this context. Of course, the West Asian region is very disturbed. There is the Saudi-Yemenis conflict. There is the Syrian situation. There is the question of economic sanctions on Iran and the US-Iranian relationship. There is the continuing problem between Israel and many of the other Arab countries. So naturally, we will have to weigh our positions very carefully, but at the same time, others will also have to do the same. It has become a multipolar world where relationships are not necessarily enmeshed. You strike a relationship with one country regardless of what relationships it has with other countries.
Sure.
So I think that in the course of the coming months and years, we will see increased interaction between India and many of the West Asian countries.
Right.
And there will be hopefully more investments into India, as for instance Aramco has agreed to do. It is going to invest a large sum of money in one of our major oil refineries on the western coast.
Absolutely. Right. So, all right. So, Professor Pant, you've not spoken about Israel much really on the discussion today. But as far as Israel and Indian ties are concerned as well, you know, we've seen them reach new heights, the bilateral relationship. Where does the relationship stand as of now?
I think the relationship has traveled a long distance. You know, we normalized the relations in 1992, and if you look at the relationship, at the gamut of issues that we are dealing with today, it's very, very significant. At one point, it used to be primarily defense relationship and intelligence relationship. But I think now the relationship is more about people to people, about how making, even looking at issues like water harvesting, rainwater harvesting, or agriculture, where Israeli expertise and technological efficiency is something that India has much to learn from. So clearly the relationship, and we have seen top leaders engaging at such close levels. Both Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Modi have been engaging regularly over the last few years. So it has certainly imparted a new dynamism to the relationship. And I think what India has been able to do successfully is, as I think was pointed out, to dehyphenate the Palestinian question from the Israeli question, and which was always this big issue around which the policy revolved. So if you look at the larger West Asian landscape, India finds itself in a relatively sweet spot. You know, we have good relations with major poles in the system. With Iran, the relationship is difficult because of external factors. But I think for India and compared to, say, the US, West Asia also matters because it is also part of the wider Indo-Pacific as India defines it, from the eastern shores of Africa to the Pacific. And I think that is not the definition of for example, of the US. So stability in that part of the world is very, very important for India, for energy reasons, for the reasons of protecting sea lanes of communication, keeping this safe and open. So I think that the larger geopolitical reality for India in West Asia remains one where India desires stability. And despite the fact that it is a region that has always been very turbulent, the fact that we have been able to maintain such cordial relations and very, very impressive relations that are on an upward trajectory, I think is something that Indian diplomacy should be really proud of at this particular point, where there is so much, so many internal rivalries fraying up in the region. But I think as the region becomes more turbulent, perhaps the choices for India would become much starker.
Right.
And then the question arises, how will India tilt and where would India go, and how would India be able to project itself as a guarantor of regional stability, which I think a lot of the regional players are looking towards India for.
Absolutely. All right, closing comments from all my guests. I'm going to ask you to be brief now. You know, talking about the success of Indian diplomacy, let's also talk about Jordan, Professor, because Jordan has traditionally had very solid ties with Pakistan, you know, even family ties between the two countries. But yet India has been able to maintain a balance with Jordan and have a very decent and very good relationship with that country.
Yeah, I mean, this family relationship is history now. The former Crown Prince used to have Crown Prince Hassan, but he is no more an important player in the Hashemite family. But Jordan is important for us for a variety of reasons. One is it's been a source of stability there in a very volatile area. Number two, it is a major supplier of rock phosphate, very important for our chemical fertilizer and food security. Thirdly, it is also a link for our ties with Palestine, the West Bank and the Palestine Authority. You know, much of the aid and other facilities go through the Jordanian corridor. And it has also been hosting Syrian refugees for a long time. So all of these factors propel that country as a significant player in this region. And I think there are no issues as far as
the bilateral relationship is concerned,
Jordan's former position, what it used to be, that is again support to Pakistan in 65, 71, they were quite vocal, and also in OIC. But now things have changed from almost all countries in this region. Saudi Arabia is also important as far as OIC is concerned, because they are members of the contact group and it is located in Jeddah. So they can play a moderating role and not necessarily buy the Pakistani propaganda whole hog on Kashmir. About Indo-Israeli relations, I would like to just underline one factor. The recent non-aligned summit in Azerbaijan, Baku, India's Minister for External Affairs made a point to emphasize our continued support to the Palestine cause. He said, irrespective of the close relations with other countries, he meant Israel, we continue to maintain our support to the Palestine.
Independent stance, really, as far as these issues are concerned.
And also, I think about this cooperation on counter-terrorism, too much has been read about Indo-Israel thing, you know, on Kashmir and all. But the Israeli practice has not been that successful, so that we can imbibe. We have a different system altogether.
All right, Ambassador. The role of the Indian diaspora in all of this and in improving ties with West Asia.
The Indian diaspora has certainly played a very, very important role. I've witnessed it directly myself. The Indian diaspora now numbers around 9.5 million in the West Asian countries, and it is in various occupations. There are business people, there are professionals, humble laborers, but all of them are by and large Indian citizens, so their ties to India remain intact, and they have been playing a solid role in earning respect for India by dint of their hard work. So in the coming years, I see this relationship as being centered around, firstly, our energy security, our need for foreign direct investment, and also emerging more and more in the direction of strategic partnerships with more and more countries. And as these strategic partnerships get reinforced, we will be able to counter negative forces such as Pakistan and its terrorist-related activities, because there will be more and more concurrence in thinking.
Absolutely. And Professor Pant, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark.
Well, I think India's equities in West Asia remain very high, and as India's equities have grown, so has India's engagement, which has become very, very vital for India's own foreign policy priorities. And I think that's why we are seeing such big investment that Indian diplomacy is making in the region, and we have paid rich dividends, and that has paid rich dividends for Indian foreign policy. I think the recent Kashmir issue is a major highlight, where I think the muted response from the region and in support for India's reaction highlights the significance of top-level engagement with the part of the region that is very, very crucial for Indian foreign policy priorities.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.